March 1945. Over the skies of Germany, a formation cuts through the cold air at nearly 600 miles per hour. Silver darts against grey clouds, American pilots at the controls, hands steady on throttles that hum instead of roar. Below, German soldiers tilt their heads upward. They see the streaks, they hear the high whine, and they believe without question that they are watching their own Messerschmitt. 262 seconds, the pride of the Luftwaffe, the jets that promised salvation. But they are wrong. For the first time, the skies over Europe hold something else. Something so secret that many Allied pilots do not even know it exists. An American jet, built in silence, flown in shadow. They thought only Germany had mastered the future of flight. They believed the jet age belonged to them alone. This is the untold story of the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, and how its creation shattered the illusion of a nation that believed it had invented tomorrow.
We actually did it!
The year is 1944. Europe burns beneath bomber trails and the thunder of piston engines. In the autumn sky above Germany, something new appears, sleek, fast, untouchable. The Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It cuts through Allied formations like a blade through silk, leaving propeller-driven Mustangs and Thunderbolts grasping at empty air. Allied pilots return to their bases shaken. They file reports that sound like fiction, an aircraft that accelerates beyond anything they have ever encountered. No propeller blur, just speed raw and impossible. In Washington and London, military planners lean over maps and intelligence photographs. The Me-262 is not just a weapon, it is a revolution, and the Allies are behind. But 3,000 miles away in a nondescript hangar in Burbank, California, something is taking shape. A project so classified that even most officers at Wright Field have never heard its designation. XP-80, America's answer to the jet age. A fighter designed not in years but in months, not by a sprawling bureaucracy, but by a small team working in secrecy under pressure without permission to fail. The man leading them is Clarence Kelly Johnson, an engineer who believes that speed comes not from size or complexity, but from clarity of vision. His team has no official name yet. They work in a rented circus tent next to the Lockheed factory. The smell of chemicals and engine grease hangs in the air. They call their makeshift workspace the Skunk Works, a joke borrowed from a comic strip, a name that will become legend. The irony is profound. While Germany races to perfect its jet technology, while Hitler demands that the Me-262 be transformed into a bomber, while Luftwaffe pilots claim mastery of the future, the Americans are already building one of their own, and almost no one knows. The race for the jet age is not what history will remember. Germany announced its arrival with fanfare. America built in silence. One nation sought to proclaim its dominance, the other simply worked. The question that remains is not whether America's jet could match Germany's. The question is whether it would arrive in time to matter and what its existence would reveal about how each nation waged its war. Germany sees the future first, not in a dream but in the roar of a turbojet engine igniting over a Bavarian airfield. The engineers at Heinkel and Junkers have been chasing this vision since before the war began, an aircraft freed from the limitations of propellers driven by pure thrust, capable of speeds that would make current fighters obsolete. By 1944, that vision has a name, Messerschmitt 262, Schwalbe, swallow. It is sleek and predatory, its swept wings angled back like a hunting bird, frozen mid-dive. Two Junkers Jumo 004 engines slung beneath those wings glowing red when pushed to full power. In level flight, it reaches 540 miles per hour. Nothing Allied can catch it. Nothing can run from it. Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated aces, flies the prototype and returns to the ground transformed. He does not speak in the measured tones of a test pilot. He speaks like a man who has touched the edge of a new era. It is as if angels are pushing, he will later say. The sensation of acceleration without the vibration of pistons, without the limiting drag of spinning blades. Just forward motion, relentless and smooth. The Me-262 enters operational service in the summer of 1944. Commando Novotny, the first jet fighter unit, begins flying combat sorties. Allied bomber crews report encounters that defy belief. An aircraft that appears from nowhere closes the distance in seconds, fires a devastating burst from 30mm cannons, and vanishes before escort fighters can react. B. 17 gunners track the jet in their sights but cannot lead it correctly. The speed differential is too great. They are shooting at ghosts. To the men of the Luftwaffe, the Me-262 is not merely a weapon, it is vindication, proof that German engineering remains superior despite the tide of war turning against them, proof that innovation can still tip the balance. In the cramped briefing rooms and hangar offices, there is talk of mass production, of entire wings equipped with jets, of a sky reclaimed from the endless waves of Allied bombers. But the dream is fragile. Hitler, obsessed with retaliation for the bombing of German cities, demands that the Me-262 be modified into a fast bomber, the Sturmvogel, the Stormbird. Precious months are lost to redesigns and political arguments. Galland fights the decision, argues that the aircraft's destiny is as a pure interceptor, but ideology overrides tactics. The Führer wants revenge, not defense. Production is chaotic. Allied bombing raids target the factories. Fuel shortages ground aircraft that should be flying combat missions. The turbojet engines, marvels of engineering, are also temperamental and short-lived. They require rare metals that Germany no longer has in abundance. Pilots must nurse the throttles, carefully aware that too much acceleration can cause a flameout, that a single rough landing can damage the delicate turbine blades beyond repair. Still, the Me-262 flies, and when it does, it is devastating. In the final months of 1,944 jet fighters rack up kills against bombers and fighters alike. They are too few to change the outcome of the war, but they are enough to terrify. Enough to force Allied planners to confront an uncomfortable truth: the enemy has leapt ahead in a dimension of warfare that was supposed to belong to the future. The Germans believe this lead is theirs alone. They believe the jet age is a German invention, a German triumph. In the cockpits and on the airfields there is a sense, fragile, fleeting but real, that history might still bend in their favor. They do not know that across the Atlantic, in a hangar that smells of canvas and oil, another jet is already flying. The intelligence reports arrive in fragments: pilot debriefs, reconnaissance photographs, intercepted radio chatter. At first, the analysts at Wright Field in Ohio believe there must be an error. Aircraft do not move that fast, but the reports keep coming consistent and undeniable. The Germans have fielded a jet fighter, operational, lethal, and the Allies have nothing to match it. In the summer of 1943, before the Me-262 ever enters combat, American military planners make a quiet decision. They cannot afford to be caught unprepared. If Germany is developing jet technology, America must do the same, and do it faster. The order goes out to Lockheed Aircraft Corporation in Burbank, California. Build a jet fighter, build it in secret, and build it now. The project lands on the desk of Clarence Kelly Johnson, chief engineer at Lockheed. He is 33 years old, brilliant, and uncompromising. He has designed the P-38 Lightning, one of the most successful fighters of the war. But this is different. This is not an evolution of existing technology. This is a leap into the unknown. Johnson is given a timeline that sounds absurd. 180 days from contract to first flight. No existing infrastructure. No proven American turbojet engine. No room for failure. He accepts without hesitation. He assembles a team of engineers, 23 men initially, and moves them into a rented circus tent adjacent to the main Lockheed factory. The tent reeks of a nearby plastics factory, a smell so pungent that one engineer jokes they should call the operation Skunk's Works, a reference to a moonshine still in the comic strip Lil Abner. The name sticks shortened eventually to Skunk Works. It will become the most famous engineering outfit in aviation history. But in 1943, it is just a tent and a group of men working 18-hour days. They do not have time for bureaucracy. Johnson establishes rules that sound radical: minimal paperwork, direct communication, no chain of command delays. If an engineer has an idea, he brings it directly to Johnson. If a machinist sees a problem on the factory floor, he stops and fixes it without waiting for approval. The system is lean, fast, almost improvisational. It is the opposite of how large organizations typically function. The design comes together with startling speed. a single-engine jet straight-winged for simplicity, with a streamlined fuselage and tricycle landing gear. The British agree to provide a Halford H1 turbojet engine, later renamed the Goblin, because America's own engine programs are still in development. The engine arrives by ship carefully crated, a piece of the future wrapped in secrecy. 143 days after the contract is signed, 37 days ahead of schedule, the XP-80 is complete. It sits on the ramp at Muroc Dry Lake in California, silver and sleek, its lines purposeful and clean. There is no ceremony, no press. Just a test pilot named Milo Burcham climbing into the cockpit, a handful of engineers watching from the ground, and the vast emptiness of the desert stretching in every direction. Burcham advances the throttle. The jet engine spools up with a rising whine, a sound unlike any piston aircraft. No rhythmic thump of cylinders firing, just a smooth building howl. The XP-80 accelerates down the dry lake bed, and then it lifts gracefully, almost effortlessly, into the January sky. It is the 8th of January 1944, 6 months before the Me-262 enters operational service. The United States has just flown its first jet fighter, and the world does not know. In the months that follow, the XP-80 will be tested, refined, pushed to its limits. But it will remain a secret, hidden behind the veil of wartime classification. While Germany proclaims its jet to the world, America flies its own in silence. Milo Burcham feels it the moment the wheels leave the ground. No vibration, no torque trying to pull the aircraft sideways. Just smooth, uninterrupted acceleration. The desert floor drops away beneath him, and the XP-80 climbs at a rate that defies his instincts. 8,000 feet per minute. In a piston fighter, such a climb would strain the engine, fill the cockpit with noise and heat. Here, there is only the steady whine of the turbojet, and the sensation of being pushed forward by an invisible hand. He levels off and advances the throttle fully. The airspeed indicator sweeps past numbers he has never seen in level flight. 500 miles per hour, 520, 540. The XP-80 is still accelerating. The controls remain light and responsive. There is no buffeting, no warning that the aircraft is approaching its limits. Burcham eases back the throttle and brings the jet around in a wide arc, descending toward the dry lake bed. When he touches down and taxis back to where the engineers are waiting, he shuts down the engine and sits in the cockpit for a moment, collecting his thoughts. Later, Kelly Johnson will record Burcham's words in his notes. It was like flying into tomorrow. The XP-80 is not a copy of the Me-262. It is not an imitation or a response born from desperation. It is an original design shaped by different constraints and different philosophies. Where the German jet uses twin engines and swept wings, the American aircraft is built around a single, more reliable engine and straight wings for ease of production. The Halford H1 turbojet, designed by Frank Halford in Britain, produces less thrust than the German Jumo engines, but is far more dependable. It does not require exotic metals. It does not flame out unpredictably. It is an engine designed for mass production, not for breaking records. The airframe itself is a study in elegant simplicity. The fuselage is built in two halves that bolt together, allowing easy access to internal systems. The wings are unswept, a deliberate choice that sacrifices some high-speed performance for predictable handling and structural simplicity. The landing gear is tricycle configuration, making the aircraft easier to taxi and reducing the risk of ground loops that plague tail-dragging fighters. Every design decision reflects a pragmatic philosophy. Build something that works, build it quickly, and build it so that factory workers can produce it in quantity. By spring of 1944, the XP-80 has proven itself in testing. It reaches 558 miles per hour in level flight, not as fast as the Me-262, but fast enough. It climbs rapidly, turns tightly, and handles in a way that reminds test pilots of conventional fighters. There are no nasty surprises, no quirks that would make it difficult for average pilots to fly. The aircraft is forgiving. It is, in the language of test pilots, honest. Production orders are placed. Lockheed begins tooling up to build the fighter in numbers, but there are delays. The American turbojet program, which was supposed to provide a domestically produced engine, runs into technical problems. The General Electric I-40 engine, an American development, is not ready. Lockheed must continue using British-supplied engines, which arrive slowly and in limited numbers. By the time production P-82s begin rolling off the assembly line, it is late 1944. The war in Europe has less than 6 months remaining. Still, the jets are built. Pilots are trained on them in California and Nevada, learning to manage the unfamiliar characteristics of turbojet engines, learning to trust the smooth acceleration and the absence of propeller torque. A handful of P-82s are packed into crates and shipped across the Atlantic. They arrive in Italy in early 1945, assigned to a small detachment for evaluation. They will fly patrols over northern Italy and southern Germany. They will be seen by German soldiers on the ground, but they will never encounter an ME 262 inches combat. The two jets born from the same technological revolution will never meet in the sky. The P-82s arrive in Europe like ghosts. There are only 2 of them initially ferried to an airfield in Italy, where Allied fighters stage operations over the collapsing Third Reich. The pilots assigned to fly them have been chosen carefully, experienced men who can evaluate the aircraft under combat conditions. But by the time they are ready to fly operational missions, the Luftwaffe is barely in the sky. Fuel shortages have grounded most German aircraft. The jet units that once seemed so threatening are scattered, their pilots exhausted their bases under constant attack. The American jets fly reconnaissance missions, high-speed dashes over enemy territory. They probe the airspace, waiting for a fight that never comes. Below, German soldiers see them pass silver streaks against the spring clouds, moving faster than anything with a propeller. In the chaos of the collapsing front, in the confusion of retreat and surrender, these soldiers make an assumption that seems entirely reasonable. They believe they are watching Me 262 seconds, their own jets. Why would they think otherwise? No one tells them the truth. There are no broadcasts, no intelligence briefings for Wehrmacht infantrymen explaining that the Americans have fielded their own jet fighter. The information is compartmentalized, restricted, known only to those with the highest clearances. And so the men on the ground look up and see what they expect to see, a symbol of German technological pride still flying, even as everything else falls apart. The war in Europe ends in May 1945. The P-80 Shooting Star has been operational for months, but it has fired no shots in anger. It has downed no enemy aircraft. It exists in the historical record as a footnote, a weapon that arrived too late to prove itself too late to change anything. But lateness is not the same as failure. The P-80's existence reveals something more profound than battlefield performance. It reveals the machinery behind the weapon, the industrial capacity, the engineering talent, the organizational efficiency that allowed America to develop a jet fighter in 143 days and then produce it in numbers while still fighting a two-front war. Germany built the Me 262 under desperation, cannibalizing resources from other programs, relying on slave labor and scattered factories vulnerable to bombing. America built the P-80 with surplus capacity, with engineers who worked voluntarily with supply chains that never broke. The jets that reach Europe before VE Day are not meant to win the war. They are proof of concept, proof that American industry can match any technological challenge given time and resources. Proof that the gap Germany opened with the Me 262 has already closed. In the final weeks of the war, a few Luftwaffe pilots encounter the P-80 at a distance. They see it and dismiss it as one of their own. There is no reason to think otherwise. The silhouette is unfamiliar, but not impossible. Jets are jets. The assumption is natural. Only later, in prisoner of war camps and post-war interrogations, will some of these men learn the truth, and their reactions will be consistent disbelief, followed by a kind of grudging realization. The Americans had built a jet, not in response to the Me 262, but in parallel with it. Not desperately, but methodically. And they had kept it secret, so secret that even now, with Germany defeated and occupied, the majority of the world does not know it exists. Historians will debate the significance. Some will argue that the P-80 mattered little because it arrived too late. Others will point to what it represented: the industrial and intellectual capacity of a nation that could innovate at speed without sacrificing quality or safety. The jet itself is almost beside the point. What matters is what it revealed about the two sides, one building from a position of strength, the other from a position of desperation. Germany dreamed of ruling the skies with technology. America simply built the future and waited for the right moment to reveal it. The prisoner of war camps fill with Luftwaffe personnel in the spring and summer of 1945. Pilots, ground crews, engineers, men who weeks earlier believed they were fighting for a nation on the cutting edge of technology. They are processed, interrogated, sorted. Some are defiant, others are simply exhausted. But nearly all of them share a common belief: whatever else Germany lost, it did not lose the race for technological supremacy. The Me-262 was theirs. The jet age was theirs. That much at least remained true. Then they are shown the P-80. The reactions are recorded in interrogation transcripts in the notes of intelligence officers who watched the prisoners' faces as American jets taxi past. Disbelief is the first response. Not anger or fear, but simple refusal to accept what they are seeing. "It cannot be one captured pilot," says, his voice flat. "The jet is ours." An American officer corrects him gently. "No, the jet belongs to everyone now. This is the P-80 Shooting Star, built by Lockheed. First flight in January 1944, operational since late 1944. Faster than most piston fighters, reliable, already in production." The pilot stares. He does not argue. He simply stares, as if the aircraft on the tarmac might disappear if he looks at it long enough. Another prisoner, an engineer who worked on Me-262 production, asks to see the engine. The request is denied, but he is shown photographs. He studies them in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he speaks. "Your engine is simpler than ours. It is not a question. It is an observation delivered with something close to respect." The German jet engines were marvels of high-performance engineering, but they were also fragile, temperamental, difficult to maintain. The American engine in the photographs looks almost pedestrian by comparison. Fewer exotic alloys, more conservative design tolerances. But it works, and it works consistently. Other prisoners learn the truth in different ways. Some hear it from guards' casual mentions in conversation. Some piece it together from the aircraft they see flying overhead during their internment. A few are taken to see captured German jets and American jets side by side, part of technical intelligence assessments. The Americans want to understand German engineering. They also want the Germans to understand what they were up against, not just in terms of manpower and resources, but in terms of innovation. One Luftwaffe ace, a man who flew both Me-262 seconds and conventional fighters, is interviewed at length. He is asked what he thought when he learned America had developed its own jet. His answer is recorded verbatim: "I thought we had been lied to, not by the Allies, by our own leaders. We were told we were the only ones. We were told the future belonged to us. But you cannot own the future. You can only try to keep up with it." Among the German engineers and scientists interned by Allied forces, there is a similar pattern of response. Shock, then curiosity, then a kind of professional admiration. These are men who dedicated years to solving the problems of jet propulsion. They know how difficult it is. They know the technical challenges involved. And they know that America solved those problems without the world noticing solved them, while also building bombers and tanks and ships in staggering quantities. Hans von Ohain, one of the pioneers of German jet engine development, will later reflect on this moment in history. He will speak of the shock of realizing that the technological lead Germany believed it possessed was an illusion. Not because German engineering was inferior, but because American engineering was simply broader, deeper, supported by an industrial base that Germany could never match. The men who flew the Me-262 believed they were piloting the future. But the future, it turned out, was already being built in a dozen different places by a dozen different nations. Germany had announced its arrival first. America had simply arrived. The P-80 is not merely an aircraft. It is evidence. Evidence of a system that could innovate without centralized control, that could move quickly, without authoritarian command, that could succeed through coordination rather than coercion. The story of its creation reveals something fundamental about the difference between the two nations locked in war. Not just a difference in resources, but a difference in how those resources could be mobilized and directed. Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works operated with a freedom that would have been impossible in Nazi Germany. He answered to Lockheed executives, who answered to military procurement officers, who answered to elected officials. But within that chain, there was flexibility. When Johnson needed a decision, he could get it in hours, not weeks. When his engineers encountered a problem, they could solve it on the spot without waiting for approval from a distant bureaucracy. The system trusted them to work. In Germany, the Me-262 program was strangled by competing interests. The Luftwaffe wanted an interceptor. Hitler wanted a bomber. Goering wanted propaganda victories. The engineers wanted time to perfect the design. Every decision required navigating layers of political consideration. Every delay was compounded by fear of retribution for failure. The result was an aircraft that took years to move from prototype to production, even as Germany's situation grew more desperate. The mathematics of the two approaches are stark. The XP-80 went from contract to first flight in 143 days. The Me-262, despite starting development earlier, took over 4 years to reach operational status. Both aircraft faced similar technical challenges. Both required solving problems that had never been solved before. But one was built by a team of 24 engineers, working in a tent empowered to make decisions and iterate rapidly. The other was built by a sprawling organization, hamstrung by ideology and internal conflict. This is not a story about German engineering being inferior. The men who designed the Me-262 were brilliant. The Jumo 004 engine, for all its flaws, was a genuine achievement. The swept-wing design was aerodynamically advanced. German scientists understood jet propulsion as well as anyone in the world. But understanding is not enough. Innovation requires an environment where ideas can move from concept to reality without being crushed by the weight of bureaucracy or the fear of political consequences. America's advantage was not just industrial capacity, though that mattered. It was not just access to resources, though, that helped. The advantage was freedom, the freedom to fail, to experiment, to question established thinking without risking imprisonment or execution. The Skunk Works could pursue radical ideas because failure meant trying again, not facing a firing squad. Lockheed engineers could speak openly about problems because honesty was valued more than loyalty to a party line. Where Germany built with fear, America built with trust. The difference showed not just in the speed of development, but in the reliability of the final product. The P-80's engine was less powerful than the Jumo 004, but it lasted longer and failed less often. The airframe was less exotic, but it was easier to manufacture and maintain. Every design choice reflected a philosophy that prioritized practical success over theoretical perfection. The lesson extends beyond aviation. In every domain of wartime technology, radar, computing, nuclear research, logistics, the pattern repeats. Democratic systems, for all their apparent inefficiency, proved capable of innovating faster and more reliably than totalitarian ones. Not because democracy is inherently more creative, but because it allows creativity to flourish without being strangled by paranoia and control. The P-80 Shooting Star is proof that technology does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by the society that creates it. A dictatorship can produce brilliant engineers, but it cannot give them the freedom to work at their full potential. A democracy can be slow and argumentative, but it can also move with surprising speed when necessity demands and when trust replaces fear. The hidden empire of American industry was not hidden at all. It was simply built on principles that totalitarian regimes could not comprehend. The war ends, but the P-80 does not retire. It cannot. The world has changed and there is no going back to the age of propellers. The jet has proven itself not as a novelty, but as the future of air combat. And so the Shooting Star transitions from experimental prototype to frontline fighter. The designation changes from XP-80 to P-80 to F-80 as the Air Force reorganizes its naming conventions. But the aircraft remains the same, America's bridge into a new era. In the years immediately following the war, the F-80 becomes the standard jet fighter of the United States Air Force.
This is not good.
Pilots transitioning from Mustangs and Thunderbolts must relearn everything they thought they knew about flying. There is no propeller torque to counteract on takeoff. There is no manifold pressure to monitor. The engine either runs or it does not, and the throttle response is smooth and linear. Some pilots adapt easily. Others struggle their instincts trained by thousands of hours in piston aircraft, now leading them astray. But the jet age is not forgiving of those who cannot adapt. Speed is the new currency of air combat, and the F-80 has it in abundance. When the Cold War begins and tensions rise, the Shooting Star is there stationed in Europe, in Japan, in Alaska. Ready. Then comes Korea. In June 1950, North Korean forces cross the 38th parallel. The United States commits air power to support South Korea, and the F-80 is among the first jets to arrive. For the first time, American jets fly in actual combat, not patrols or evaluations, but real missions against real enemies. They provide close air support for ground forces, strafe supply convoys, attack airfields. And then on the 8th of November 1950, an F-80 pilot named Russell Brown encounters a MiG-15 over the Yalu River. The engagement lasts seconds. Brown sees the Soviet-built jet maneuvers into position fires. The MiG goes down. It is the first jet versus jet combat in history, and an American pilot has won it. The moment is symbolic, almost mythic. The age that began with the Me-262 and the P-80 has now fully arrived. Air combat will never again be about propellers and reciprocating engines. The future has become the present. Yet, there is irony in this victory. The MiG-15 is a superior aircraft to the F-80 inches, nearly every measurable way. It is faster climbs, better turns, tighter. It is also designed with German research data and engineers captured after the war brought to the Soviet Union under Operation Osoaviakim, the Soviet equivalent of America's Operation Paperclip. The swept-wing design that the Me-262 pioneered has been refined and perfected in Soviet factories. The Germans, who once believed they owned the jet age, have become tools in a new conflict between superpowers. America, too, has brought German scientists into its programs. Wernher von Braun and his rocket team, aerodynamicists who studied high-speed flight, engineers who worked on turbojets and swept wings. The knowledge that Germany developed in desperation has been distributed across the world, absorbed into the military-industrial complexes of nations that defeated it. The F-80 serves throughout the Korean War, eventually replaced by more advanced designs. The F-86 Sabre itself influenced by German research and later generations of jets that will push speed and performance even further. But the Shooting Star remains in service for years, training pilots flying reconnaissance, proving that the decisions made in a circus tent in 1943 were sound. Kelly Johnson will go on to design the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, and other aircraft that redefine what is possible. The Skunk Works will become legendary, a symbol of American innovation at its best. But it all begins here with the P-80, an aircraft built in secret, flown in shadow, and revealed only when the world was ready to see it. The jet age that Germany believed it owned has become something larger, more complex, more contested. And the Americans who built their jet in silence have inherited the sky. What does the P-80 mean in the end, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of the war that created it and the peace that followed? It is a story about timing and secrecy, about the choices nations make when survival demands innovation. But it is also a story about the systems that enable innovation, the cultures, the philosophies, the freedoms that allow engineers to work without fear and ideas, to become reality without being crushed by ideology. Germany announced the jet age because it had to. The Me-262 was not just a fighter, it was propaganda, a promise to a desperate population that technology could still save them. Every flight was a declaration. Every victory was proof that the Reich remained superior, that the Allied advantage in numbers could be overcome by German genius. The jet became not just a weapon, but a narrative, a story Germany told itself about its own destiny. America built its jet differently, not as propaganda, but as preparation. Not from desperation, but from a quiet recognition that the future was coming, and it was better to be ready. The P-80 was not announced because it did not need to be. Its existence was enough. When the time came to reveal it, the revelation carried a different kind of weight, not the weight of a nation grasping for hope, but the weight of a nation that had already moved on to the next challenge. The paradox is striking. Germany built the first operational jet fighter and lost the war. America built the second and won. Technology alone does not determine outcomes. The capacity to produce that technology, to support it, to integrate it into a larger strategy, that is what matters. The Me-262 was a miracle achieved through desperation. The P-80 was a solution achieved through capacity. In the years after the war, the engineers and pilots from both sides will meet, compare notes, share stories. There will be mutual respect, even admiration. The technical challenges were universal. The solutions were different, but the problems were the same. And in those conversations, a truth will emerge. The jet age was never owned by any one nation. It was a threshold that all of aviation crossed together, each in their own way, each shaped by the circumstances and systems that created them. War reveals what nations are capable of when pushed to their limits, but it also reveals what they value, what they trust, how they organize themselves under pressure. The story of the P-80 and the Me-262 is not just about speed and engineering. It is about the difference between building from fear and building from freedom. The men who watched silver streaks cross the German sky in the spring of 1945 never knew what they were seeing. To them, the jet was a symbol of power, a reminder that even in defeat, Germany possessed something the world feared. They looked up and saw their own technology, their own achievement. They believed the future still belonged to them, at least in this one domain. But history would reveal another truth. The most powerful weapon of the war was not speed or steel, or even the jet engine itself. It was the freedom to imagine, the freedom to question, to experiment, to fail, and try again without retribution. It was the ability of a small team in a rented tent to outpace a national program backed by ideology and fear. It was the quiet confidence of a nation that did not need to announce its innovations because it knew they would speak for themselves. The P-80 shooting star flew into an uncertain future. Its pilots did not know if they would face the Me-262 inches combat. They did not know if the war would last long enough for their aircraft to matter. But they flew anyway, testing the limits of a new kind of machine, writing the manual for a new kind of warfare. And when the war ended, before they could prove themselves, they did not stop. They kept flying, kept training, kept preparing for the conflicts that would follow. War changes men. It takes them from the familiar and thrusts them into circumstances that test everything they believe about themselves and the world. But innovation changes history. It reshapes what is possible, what is expected, what comes next. The jet age did not begin in Germany or America. It began in the minds of engineers on both sides who saw beyond the present and built toward what could be. The story of the P-80 is not about victory in battle. It is about the victory of systems over ideology, of preparation, over desperation, of trust, over fear. It is about the quiet power of building something remarkable and not needing the world to know until the moment arrives when knowing changes everything. The sky belonged to no one, but those who understood freedom knew how to fly through it.